I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Shalini, who is the director of our learning solutions. Yeah. So she's a versatile learning design professional. She has a lot of experience in instructional design, both for ILT, VILT, and e-learning, and also a lot of experience in training, content writing, as well as conducting educational workshops. She is a very good speaker and a presenter, and she holds a master's in English literature from the University of Hyderabad.
I'm very glad that all of you can join us today. A very warm welcome once again. So, to dive right into it, I just request all of you to take a quick look at this situation that you see represented on the slide in front of you. So, I would like to request you to have a willing suspension of disbelief. So, basically, you're in your home at your computer, and right now you hear a sound, and there's a masked burglar who wants you to hand over the keys to the house and warns you that you can't escape. So, what will you do? And also, you're alone at home and you are going to be alone for the next 3 days. Okay, well, it's not surprising that option A is the most popular one. Basically, it is just to illustrate, a what if scenario where you put yourself in a situation and you think about what you would do. Now, this is something that we do all the time, even in our everyday lives. We are very good at, especially at imagining worst case scenarios and figuring out options for ourselves. The scenario may or never happen to us in our life, but that doesn't mean we are not prepared, and especially in such trying times. So, what can scenarios do to make your training come alive as we go along with the rest of the webinar? So, a quick introduction to scenario based training for those new to it. Basically, it's a way of teaching or training using a virtual, interactive, problem based context. So, the main thing about scenario based training is that it is a safe environment in which learners can really test out their responses and see what the implications are. So, it's a risk free environment, and the situations and the scenarios that we use mirror the real world. Now, it may not always be possible to have exposure to every single situation in the real world, but using scenario based training, we can present these hypothetical situations which the learner may encounter or is very likely to encounter. And the reason why scenario based training works is because learners are drawn into a problem, and they are given feedback progressively as they progress through solving the problem. And of course, as many of you pointed out in your selections, it gives you a chance to assess their performance in a real world scenario, what they would do, what if. So they get a chance to apply their prior experience, their critical thinking skills, and their knowledge of the subject. Now, what are the benefits? I think for most of us, one of the biggest benefits is that they are very engaging. They're a very engaging and memorable way to make sure that learners can retain the content, not just retain, but also comprehend the content. So it helps both in comprehension as well as recall. And scenarios can also be fun because there is no risk, and you're still encouraged to explore the various options. And then the other benefit is, of course, provided your scenarios mirror your real life, they can set a very realistic foundation, a very realistic platform for the learner to engage and test their knowledge. And as we looked at earlier, they're application based. Good scenarios are those which encourage the learner to, uh, synthesize what they know about a certain subject and arrive at the application. How would they do it when faced with such a situation? And these are especially ideal for gray areas and sensitive topics. For instance, it's not always, it doesn't always work when you discuss in an ILT something as sensitive as sexual harassment, for instance. because learners may not even speak up, or they may hesitate to respond. But this is where setting up scenarios in an e-learning can really drive home the point much more effectively than it would if you were just to give them a list of policies that learners have to just go through, and sensitive topics, as I mentioned, and gray areas where there are really no right and wrong responses as such, but the learner is forced to think through the implications and then decide for themselves which is the best option. So, some more benefits here: a better understanding of implications in a risk free environment. So, not only do learners get a chance to identify potential risks, but they can also think through the mitigation points for each of those. And who doesn't love a good story, right? I think for those of us who use storytelling and scenarios in our training, we found that the learners are likely to complete that training, they're likely to visit that page, they're likely to do better in the assessment because there is better retention. And excuse me, of course, there is better participation because everybody likes a good challenge. So the moment you're faced with a problem, even in real life, I think all our gray cells go into overdrive. So this is what happens when we use scenarios in our e-learning. You just draw the learner in, and engaging the learner becomes so much more easier, so that for the rest of the course too, you have the learner's attention. And again, because it's a risk-free environment and learners are free to explore choices, they can confront their fears and see what are the implications, and then that cuts off a lot of apprehension in the learner's mind. Now let's take a quick look at the various types of scenarios. I have segregated this based on the purpose. And this is a resource that I've shared the link here. It's a very useful resource. So basically, you can call scenarios exploratory in the sense that they encourage you to explore what might happen. So, a hypothetical situation where you are able to see possibilities. And the second type is the normative one, where, how do you reach, given a scenario, what do you have to do to reach a well defined specific outcome? And the third is predictive scenarios in the sense what is sure to happen, what will happen. So this is more concrete than what might happen, which actually allows the learner to explore. So we'll go through each of these types in a very shortly. So here's an example of an exploratory scenario, or what might happen. So this is an example from one of our courses. What do you think might happen if we don't limit warming caused by climate change? And then there are these various options. So when do we use exploratory scenarios? So as I just mentioned, when it's important to make the learner think of many possibilities, and you want them to think through each. So your teaching feedback can be given for each option. So instead of just telling the learner that something is right or wrong, you don't even tell them whether their selected option is the correct choice or not, but just give the implications. Now, this is more likely to stick in the learner's mind than to be just told that something is right or wrong. And for those who selected the best option, it is still a good way to help them explore the other implications. What would happen if they selected something else? So this works very well for exploratory kind of training, as this example just showed. So the next type is the normative scenario type, where there is a clearly defined outcome. And it is important for you to let the learner know that, there is just one correct step, one correct choice, which will lead them to that defined outcome. So the outcome is a certain result. So this is something where, it works very well for areas of training where the learner needs to synthesize some information and put it together to reach that outcome. So for instance, if you have some change management initiative going on at work and there is a defined outcome you're looking at, you could provide various options to introduce this new paradigm at work. So here's an example, a very simple example that we use from one of our courses. What should this person do to reach that particular outcome? Now, the third type of scenarios are the predictive scenarios, which, as I mentioned earlier, are what will happen. So, this is important when you want to drive home the point to the learner that something is going to be definite, if they select a given choice. So, basically, as the name suggests, predictive scenarios work well in predicting the long term situation, the long term effects in a given situation. For example, you could use predictive scenarios in your sales training to demonstrate how failure to be consultative with a customer can actually put off the customer and not result in repeat business. So you can present a couple of options on what do you think is the best thing you should do at this point. The customer is in this frame of mind, and here you have a winning solution. So what should you do now? So this works very well in that kind of actually sort of behavioral training, the softer skills that need to be taught. Again, on the screen, you see an example from one of our courses where what do you think this person did? So there's an entire story built up, a short story, and the learner is asked, what do you think this person did next? And there are a couple of very believable options. All of them could equally well be right. And then the feedback goes on to tell them why, one of them is really the best option. Now, I want to just spend a few minutes on talking about the types of scenarios based on their complexity. I think all of us are familiar with simple scenarios where you give a situation, you give the learner a question, and you ask the learner to select an option. So, those are the simple one page, non branching scenarios. Again, these can be very effective. Uh, they can be far more effective than just presenting the content and asking the learner to go through it. The other type is the branching scenarios, which can be slightly tricky, but which are well worth the effort because these are things that these kind of scenarios really make the learning very sticky. So when do we use branching scenarios? So the ideal use case is where it is important to let the learners face the consequences of their decisions. So you present a scenario, you give them three or four possible options, and then instead of just telling them what is the right, best response and what is not a good response, let them play out. You let their choices play out to at least the next two levels. So as they proceed down their choice, they're locked into that particular learning path and they explore what are the further consequences, what are the further decisions that they would need to take. Maybe there's a way for them to, if they selected a wrong option, maybe there is a way for them to fix it. So typically, branching scenarios are used when more than one correct response is possible, but there is the ideal choice to be made. So, an example is that of leadership training with good, better, and the best possible choices that the learner can make in that given scenario. So, here's a very simple example of a branching scenario, which I actually took from the Articulate blog, which is incidentally a very good resource for anybody wanting to explore anything to do with learning design, actually. So here's a situation where you're a new employee and you need to get started. What should you do? So there are two options for the learner. You ask your manager or you ask somebody else. Now, option A tells you what happens if you go down that path. So you select ask your manager and then what is the response? And then option B, of course, then goes on to tell you what would happen if you went with that flow. So this is just a very simple illustration of a branching scenario. Now, coming to building scenarios, how do you do this? I think it's fairly straightforward when it comes to simple non branching scenarios because all you have to do is work with the SME to get possible situations. Or sometimes, you don't even need the SME because the content itself is so it gives you so many interesting possibilities. But how do we generally go about? So I'll very quickly take you through the planning, design, and development of scenarios. As with any other training initiative, your choice of scenarios will depend on the learning objectives. So the first and the most important step is to analyze the learning objectives and see if the kind of objective that you're hoping to accomplish by the end of your training is best served by using scenarios. And if so, what kind of scenarios? Will branching scenarios work best or non branching scenarios work best? So, based on our experience with various kinds of courses and projects in learning design, this is a best practice that we can use branching scenarios for learning objectives which are at a higher Bloom's level. So anything equal to a Bloom's level 3, because that's when you start the application. You begin to teach learners at the level of application. And then you again take decisions on should they be exploratory scenarios, should they be normative, or do you want predictive scenarios? Again, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And just a quick note, the above two categories, A and B, are not really mutually exclusive. It's just that you might want to make notes for yourself when you're analyzing your content. If you feel that there is a point at which a scenario will make sense, it's good to just put it there for your reference so that later on when you're designing it, you have a kind of a tentative list of possible scenarios or possible types of scenarios that you may use. And then during the planning, you also decide if your scenarios should be written in the first person or in the third person. Now, this might seem like a very simple decision, and you're right about that. I think for sensitive topics such as sexual harassment, it's recommended that we use the third person. Now, coming to the actual design, as we go through the content, uh, as we spot opportunities for scenarios, we also have to think of the possible situations, the possible characters in those situations. So, if you want your training to be effective and engaging, it pays to spend a little time up front in coming up with believable characters, some character that the learner can relate to. And once you have your characters and your scenarios, you can identify those where you need the subject matter experts' inputs. Now, sometimes the content we use could be so technical, or it could be in such a domain where we don't have too much experience. This is where having a SME to collaborate with you in developing the scenarios really works well. And if you have decided, another aspect of design is if you have decided on using branching scenarios, you can review the content and identify all those possible decision points and also list out all the various alternative outcomes based on each choice. Now, the third aspect, the last point here is I think many of us burnt our fingers when we first got into scenario based training, when we just started developing the scenarios directly, in the storyboard stage. I'm referring to branching scenarios here. Now, it is a very good practice to map out your entire scenario flow. So, something like a blueprint or a wireframe flow outside of your PowerPoint. So, even before you get to the storyboarding stage, in your design, it's very important to have all your decision charts, your flow charts, your decision points, and the outcomes and the teaching feedback you want to provide at each outcome. It's important to map it out very clearly. I think there are some tools also to help you do this. If nothing, just jot it down, let this be drawn out on a sheet of paper. It's amazing the level of clarity you get when you just map it out very clearly. And this makes the storyboarding part really clear. And at that point, you know exactly which option leads to which outcome and what you need to do to take it further. Now, coming to the development aspect, develop the scenarios in the tool of your choice, depending on whatever tool your organization is using. So you can develop them using Storyline, Rise, Captivate, or iSpring. And the most important thing to keep in mind in the development stage is to test them out well. Now, although we may have a very clear roadmap of our entire scenarios, have a very clear blueprint, when it comes to development, sometimes branching scenarios can be tricky. So it's very important that we test them again and again before we actually release them to a pilot group. You'll find that a lot of things which you thought would work out uh, actually may not be the best possible choice there. So test out your branching scenarios and make sure that when you're developing your storyboards, you have all the right hyperlinks in place so that you can simulate the actual course in your PowerPoint so that you can actually see the consequences and the various learning paths. Now, coming to where do we use them? So, when and how should we be using these scenarios? Basically, it's very boring, and learners find it difficult to engage with content which is just cut and dry and just presented as policies or just, mandates. But when you put the learner in thought provoking situations, then it helps them to apply what they have learned to various contexts. And it helps them to see how those policies apply, and you can use the feedback for the options to teach all the implications of the wrong consequences. And in fact, this is very effective, especially if there is resistance on the learner's part to learning any area, because they are mostly experienced with, you know, a, a lot of content being dumped on them and them being expected to remember the policies and so on. But put them into compelling scenarios, and retention is automatically going to shoot up. Soft skills training, communication, behavioral training, these are also very good areas where we can use scenarios, because these are areas of training which involve nuances. There are gray areas, there are sensitive topics, and it's very important for the learner to understand these nuances. And sometimes there is no single correct answer. So, what works best is you put the learner into various situations in which they have to select their course of action. They have to first interpret it, then select their best course of action based on what they already know, and then they make their choice going ahead. So we can use branching scenarios, especially in soft skills and behavioral and communication training, to mirror how the learner's responses in a situation can also influence the other people involved in that situation. But you actually see it being played out when the other person also responds. So it is like building up a mini story with a beginning, an interesting middle, and an ideal end. Now, again, I think a lot of you selected critical thinking skills training as being ideal for scenarios, and that's right, because these are things which involve a lot of practice. So, analyzing a situation and determining the best action based on broad principles. Now, this is something where, you know, uh, it forces the learner to engage and to think, and it challenges their preconceived notions. It clears misconceptions, and it also tells them what are the various possible outcomes. So these are very useful. Scenarios here are very useful to help the learners not just know what is the best selection, but also help them understand how they can use uh, the correct criteria, which would be covered through the training content, in arriving at the best possible decision. And if you're presenting a scenario before you're teaching the content, that is also a very good way to get the learner to think through a problem, and then you present through the feedback and through the subsequent pages that follow why the choice was either right or wrong. So that's another way where you lead with a scenario, and then you use it as a bridge to the teaching content that follows. And another area where scenarios are very effective are those kind of trainings where there's high risk, you cannot afford to let the learner make a mistake on, for example, on a shop floor where certain trainings can be risky, expensive, or maybe it's not possible to simulate that situation and let the learners see for themselves what the consequences are. Mission, culture, the values, the practices, the departments, the SOPs, policies, and so on. Now, this is fairly straightforward, and since a new hire to the organization is coming with uh, not not with any familiarity with what they are going to engage with, using scenarios here would be an overkill because you're presenting this information to them for the first time, and it's not that they can use their critical thinking skills to select the best choice in a given situation, because these things vary from organization to organization, or for the most part. So this is something where you may want to avoid using scenario based training because it might be a bit of an overkill. Now the same thing applies to foundational training on any topic as well. Now, the thing with scenarios is that they assume that the learner is coming to the learning with some level of knowledge, some level of existing knowledge about that particular topic, so that they can apply that knowledge and arrive at the best possible choice in a given situation. But if the learners are entirely new to the subject, a structured linear path for learning is the best. Now, this again works effectively because it helps the learner to build on their existing knowledge step by step. So, for foundational training on any topic, you may want to avoid scenario based training. So, coming to a few best practices. Now, I know that some of us are very enthusiastic about using scenarios, and once you get neck deep into it, it's very easy to kind of go in deeper and deeper, even though there is no requirement, or even though it doesn't the content doesn't really lend itself to that kind of an approach. So the best practice for scenarios is just keep them simple and manageable. If you find yourself getting hopelessly lost in it, you can be totally sure that the learner is going to find themselves uh, lost as well. And again, to make sure that the content, the scenarios content is compelling and engaging, we need to capture the real problems and decision points that the learner is likely to face in their everyday work. Now, this is something that happens on the job. On the job training is a lot about facing a real problem and then finding that probably what you learned about the subject was not adequate enough, and then you check with your peers, you check with your supervisors and so on what is the best thing to do. Now, if we could mirror those situations and build scenarios around them, you're giving the learner a chance to really learn and apply and take the best decisions that they would take in their everyday jobs. Now, another thing is to create believable distractors. I think this applies to any kind of assessment. Sometimes the right answer is such a dead giveaway that it seems like a waste of effort to build the assessment in the first place. So it's very important that we build believable distractors. And as I mentioned earlier, since this is a risk free environment, you can create worst case scenarios without the learner being fearful of the implications of their decisions. And one quick way of making scenarios is you can use existing case studies, and you can identify the various points at which the learner would have to take decisions and create scenarios. And in fact, you could take this to several levels of decision making, as we would do with branching scenarios. And again, one of the best practices is to use characters that the learners can relate to, because no matter how wonderfully put together the scenario is, if the learner finds that they cannot relate to the characters, then you've just lost them. So, this is a very simple but effective best practice, which will make your training come alive. A few more best practices for customer specific business scenarios, which are probably outside of your domain. it is very imperative that we get help from the subject matter experts, because I think we found the hard way that sometimes we've developed complex scenarios and then send them to the SME only to find that they are not something that the learner would encounter in the first place. So it is important to get to work collaboratively with the SME when we are developing trickier or complicated scenarios. And another best practice is, as I mentioned earlier, first create your blueprint outside of PPT. So the design is more important, or probably needs more of your effort and time than the actual development. Because once you get into the development stage, it's just a matter of following and executing all those decisions that you took. And another thing, another best practice to keep in mind when we're talking about branching scenarios is that we need to make sure that the learner doesn't hit a dead end. So even if they take the wrong decisions, there should be some way for the learner to loop back to the original decision point where you can then give feedback. And fortunately, there are many authoring tools which have branching scenario templates, and vendors who have experience in using them. So it might be worthwhile to explore, even though you may not be doing the development yourself. Uh, it may be worth it as instructional designers, as training managers, to kind of get acquainted with what is out there, what are the capabilities of the tool that you intend using when it comes to developing scenarios. A few quick takeaways. I think we've already gone through them, so I'll just keep this very short. So, the scenarios basically encourage learners to take bold decisions and to apply their knowledge, and they see their poor choices played out. And it prepares, these scenarios can prepare them for a foreseeable future. So, what might happen? And we can use branching scenarios when it's important to demonstrate at every level the implications of their choices. And the final one to keep in mind is to not use scenarios for the sake of using them, but ensuring that our effort is well spent only where the decisions really matter.